But the truth was, Victor Pearce was just as scary and, if not feared more, inside the Victorian prison system than he was on the outside.
All I have in this world is my laws, my word, and I don't break them for long.
Rightio legends, Chaos Chronicles, and we're back again with another video. And so today we're doing a video on Victor Pearce. So who is Victor Pearce? Well, he was pretty much criminal royalty in Melbourne. He was one of the sons of Kath Pettingill, and himself and his brothers were definitely a name to fear in the 1980s and 1990s. But before we get into it, legends, if you haven't already, please jump down there, shoot me a subscription. That'd be absolutely appreciated. And if you tap that bell icon, you'll never miss any of my clips again. Well, rightio, let's get into it. So, Victor George Pearce. He was a very well-known Melbourne identity. And unlike his brothers, so his brother Dennis Allen, Peter Allen, Lex Pearce, there was a lot of them. And unlike those trio of brothers who were mainly had their fingers in most of the pies when it come to drug dealing in Melbourne. So Dennis Allen was one of the biggest heroin dealers in Melbourne and was about to come unstuck in the end. And as a matter of fact, he actually got charged for selling drugs to the failed New South Wales police officer, Roger Rogerson. And so Roger Rogerson was actually convicted of supplying Dennis heroin, but was later had all the charges drop on appeal. But he was convicted of that. And unlike his brothers, Victor Pearce was an armed robber, and so he had a team of armed robbers, and they were pretty heavy at what they did. And so at the time there was a number of armed robberies that had happened, where security guards had weapons used against them. And so the failed Victorian armed robbery squad, which is now defunct from illegal doings and from being caught doing illegal things like selling drugs and selling precursors of drugs to major criminal identities throughout Melbourne. So that was disbanded because of that. But before that, the armed robbery squad in Melbourne was just as feared as the armed robbers were, and they had a bad name. And as a matter of fact, so all of the comedy shows in the 80s and 90s, like Full Frontal, Fast Forward, all of those type of shows actually used to do comedy shows, where they used to make jokes of the Victorian police being so happy to put a bullet in you. And so it was a very common knowledge that the armed robbery squad especially were very violent. And there's a number of people that are actually in the ground right now, buried because of the Victorian armed robbery squad. And so this is exactly what had happened when the investigation started on Victor Pearce's armed robbery squad. And so what had actually happened was there was an investigation into an armed robbery that had gone on prior. So the armed robbery squad was doing an investigation and following Graham Jensen, who was a famous member of Victor Pearce's armed robbery crew. And so, like I said, they were being followed because of previous armed robberies that had been committed around Melbourne, and the length of violence that they were willing to go to commit these armed robberies was coming rather concerning. And so anyway, Graham Jensen was being followed that day, and there's a number of things that happen on that day that a lot of people, even retired detectives that were on the scene that day, say that it was like so. Anyway, they say that when they were following Graham Jensen, he realised that he was being followed. They then tracked him in. He pulled out a sawn-off 22 rifle, pointed it at police, and then they just literally obliterated him. And so a lot of people have said, even retired police officers have said that that gun was definitely planted and they took that guy's life for absolutely no reason. And so what actually happened out of that is quite brutal. So the whole armed robbery crew, so which consisted of Graham Jensen, Victor Pearce, Trevor Penningill, Anthony Farrell, Peter McAvoy, they were a bunch of very, very violent people. And so they actually made a deal that day and they said, for each one of our crew lives that you take, we will take two of yours. So what does that mean? They meant that for every one of their gang members' lives that were taken, they were going to go out and take the lives of two police officers. And so, which is exactly what they did. So, enter the Wall Street police killings. So, Victor Pearce was believed to be one of the masterminds behind that. So that was where the police constable's tyre and ear were called to a stolen car, what they believed was a stolen car. And when they got out of the vehicle to check that stolen car, they were set upon by a group of men who opened fire on them pretty brutally. Actually, it's one of the most famous case in Australian Victorian crime history. And unfortunately, the two police officers lost their life. And so this actually started one of the biggest police investigations in Victorian history at the time. Obviously, it was a very big investigation. You know, two constables lost their life in a very brutal way, and they were definitely, you know, not ready for it, and were set upon while they weren't ready, and were even set upon with their own guns. So it was pretty brutal. But anyway, so massive investigations across Victoria to look for who done this, and it wasn't very long before they realised who had done this, and so they had their fingers pointed at Victor Pearce, Trevor Penningill, Anthony Farrell, and Peter McAvoy. And so there was massive investigations, and they were ultimately arrested and charged for the murders of the two police officers. And so the police pretty much had an open and shut case. They had um, Victor Pearce's wife, who was going crown witness and gave evidence of what happened at the house before they left to do that to police, and then what happened the days after it. And she was one of their major witnesses, but also one of Victor Pearce's and Dennis Allen's nephews was also one of their major witnesses. And so what actually happened was, so Victor Pearce's wife actually ended up, so they put her in witness protection. She was sent off to a secret location where she had two police officers guarding her at all times. And so she actually ended up having a sexual relationship with one of these officers, and really brought the investigation to its knees. And then when the investigation got to court, um, Victor Pearce's nephew Jason refused to give evidence as well. Victor Pearce's wife Wendy had a sudden case of memory loss and said that she couldn't remember anything that happened. And so ultimately, the police case was ultimately finished. And so every single charge on every single one of those people was dropped. and they all walked from court on this day. And so they knew, every one of those members knew that their days were probably numbered, and that was exactly how it was, because every single one of those people that was in that crew ended up dying in a pretty violent, brutal way. And I just think that it's crazy. But even Victor Pierce, so Victor Pierce went on to live a life of crime after that. He was just as feared inside the Victorian prison system as he was outside. Now, I can remember going through the Victorian prison system as a youngster, all the absolute horror stories that I would hear about Victor Pierce and his brothers at Pentridge Prison, and some of the crazy stuff that used to go on there. It was very common for people to be carrying around axes and, shanks as big as kitchen knives. And Victor Pierce was one of these people. Anyone that can bring drugs in and cause corruption and stuff like that is always going to have a lot of pull in prison, and which is something that himself and his brothers really, really thrived in prison, and they had a massive, massive name in prison. And as a matter of fact, so when Chopper Reed used to war with people, he was at war with Dennis Allen, and he was at war with Victor Pierce as well. And so you can hear on many occasions Chopper Reed saying, how they were in prison, and they always had all the drugs and all the money. And well, that's exactly why Chopper was at war with him, because he wanted all that drugs and all those money. But I guess, all of these stories have such a similar ending, and that's no different from Victor Pierce's. So one morning, Victor Pierce was sitting in his car. It was a VS Commodore. He was sitting in his car on the side of the road when all of a sudden another car pulled up, and then from the passenger seat, someone has let go a whole magazine of bullets straight into Victor Pierce from half a meter away. So he had absolutely no chance of surviving that. And so, yeah, he ultimately lost his life on that night in 2002. Now, there were so many stories going around about how he passed away and who might have been responsible, because you've got to remember, this is somebody who was charged for taking two police officers' lives in a pretty brutal fashion. And I'll be the first one to put my hand up and say the Victoria Police, especially back then, was so corrupt. And yeah, it's just crazy. And there was a lot of people, that were believing that Victor's life was taken by either serving Victorian police officers or retired Victorian police officers that might have been familiar with the case. But that wasn't to be. So Victor's killer was ultimately charged. I think it was around 2009, and actually ended up going down for it and ended up doing a 2 year sentence. He got a 20-year sentence for it. And so they actually say that this person and Benji Veneman were the people that took Victor Pierce's life. So fast forward to 2024. So the person who had spent all of this time in prison since 2009 for taking the life of Victor Pierce had all the charges dropped. So himself, along with so many criminals from the Victorian underworld, had their charges overturned because of the Informer 3030, so the Nicola Gobbo stuff. So he was one of those people who got his charges overturned and was ultimately not charged for taking any lives. And so I guess still today, Victor Pierce's life, along with a lot of the underworld killings that took place, and there was 36 of them that took place. And so Victor's name is one of those that's etched in history as never to be solved. And I would imagine that they would never, ever, ever find the answer to that, because in order to find the answer, they probably need to have Nicola Gobbo on the stand again, and that will never ever happen. She's probably hiding under a rock somewhere, realizing that she just put some of Victoria's most dangerous criminals in prison for life, and ultimately, yeah, because of her bullshit lies, every single one of those people was let out of prison, but every single one of them done at least 10 to 15 years before they were let out. So you can guarantee that a lot of these people would have some hatred for her. But yeah, there you go. Like, Victor Pearce was absolute criminal royalty at one stage, and his name was spoken with fear and was absolutely one of the most feared criminal identities from Melbourne. And he came from one of the most feared criminal identity families in Melbourne, where nearly every single member of that family was a major, major criminal, a killer, or major bank robber. They were major, major team players, and that whole family used to make people tremble. Now, I know people are going to say a lot of stuff now that it's 30 years later, blah, blah, blah. But the truth is, that whole family had the whole Melbourne walking on eggshells in its time. Now, I remember specifically going to the Cherry Tree Hotel in Richmond. My grandmother used to work there, and I remember all of the brothers used to be there. There used to be Victor, Dennis, Lex, Peter. All of them used to drink there. That was Dennis's pub, and you could see that's the nature of those people. I remember seeing it. I remember seeing a lot of things with my own eyes as a child. And I just know that they were the dudes that you always knew had money, because I would always go up and ask them for money for the jukebox, because they would always have money, and you'd always see them throwing notes around and stuff. But let's not get it twisted. Victor Pearce was one of the most feared and one of the most active criminals inside and outside the prison system in Melbourne in the 80s and 90s and 70s, actually. And there's just no two ways about it. Now, I know there's going to be a lot of people that are going to have something to say now that they've all been dead for so long, but the truth is the truth. And these people said those names with fear, and Victor Pearce was definitely one of those, and he was definitely one of Melbourne's most feared, and hence why we have done the video today. And I hope you guys love that. Well, there you go, guys. Another one of our Melbourne's underbelly's most feared, and that was Victor Pearce. So next week we're doing the whole Pettingill family. So that will include Victor, Dennis, Trevor, Lex, Peter. Yeah, there's a lot of them, and yeah, they were a pretty brutal family. So that will be next Sunday. So you definitely want to tune in for that one. And if there's anyone else you'd like me to do a video on, please don't be shy. Chuck it down in the comments section of this video, and I will do my utmost best to get around to it with a video. I've been the Chaos Chronicles. You guys have been absolutely awesome. And just quickly before we go, I also have paid memberships available, guys, where I just dropped a Chopper Read footage, Chaos from the Vault video. So the forgotten footage of Chopper Read. So some very old footage that no one would have seen for a very long time. And I always say that the memberships aren't for everybody, because they are paid memberships. But it's an absolute awesome way to show your support for the Chaos Chronicles, and I absolutely appreciate every single one of you and every single one of you subscribers and all the viewers. And as always, legends, don't do drugs and crime and you won't end up in prison. We out.